The night was quiet. Too quiet for a world about to end. Snow fell softly over Yekaterinburg, the kind that muffles footsteps and turns breath into ghosts. Inside the dim walls of the Ipatiev House, candlelight trembled over the faces of a family who once ruled 1/6 of the earth. Tsar Nicholas II stood by the window, his eyes hollow, yet dignified. His wife Alexandra clasped a small icon, her whispering lips moving in prayer. Their children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and the frail Alexei, tried to stay awake, huddled together like frightened birds in the dark. Outside, boots crunched in the snow. The echo of rifles being readied cut through the silence like a whisper of fate. It was the end of an empire, and the beginning of a legend that would haunt Russia forever. If history still breathes within you, let it speak. Subscribe and walk with us through the shadows of the past. The bells of St. Petersburg rang with an echo that stretched across the Neva, their sound soft yet heavy, as if the city itself was mourning before the grief had even begun. It was the year 1894, and deep within the marble corridors of the Winter Palace, a 26-year-old man stood staring into a mirror. His name was Nicholas Alexandrovich Romanov, heir to one of the most ancient dynasties in the world. Behind him the empire waited, vast, frozen, magnificent, and restless. He did not want this. He had never wanted this. In his private journal, written in a careful hand, Nicholas confessed, my God, what will happen to me and to all of Russia? I am not prepared to be a czar." Outside, carriages clattered on the icy streets as the city bustled with rumors. The sudden death of his father, Alexander III, had struck the empire like thunder. The strong, iron-willed Tsar, the man known as the peacemaker, and that was gone, leaving his son untested, uncertain, and utterly alone beneath the golden double-headed eagle. Nicholas's coronation was a spectacle of light and fear. The golden domes of Moscow glimmered beneath the May sun. Choirs sang in cathedrals and tens of thousands gathered to glimpse their new ruler. But beneath the glory, something darker stirred, a premonition of tragedy. On the fields of Kodinka, where a festival was held to honor the coronation, over 1,000 people were trampled to death in a panic for bread and trinkets. The bodies lay scattered, silent, beneath banners proclaiming the dawn of a new reign. When Nicholas attended a ball that same evening, society whispered behind jeweled fans. An ill omen, they said. The Tsar dances on the graves of his people. That night, the young Tsar stood alone by a window, staring into the darkened streets. Snow began to fall. Unseasonal, strange. And in that falling snow, he saw ghosts. Nicholas was a man born in the wrong age. He believed in honor, in God, and the sacred duty of kings, but his people no longer believed in kings at all. Russia, stretching from the Baltic to the Pacific, was a land of contradictions. Grand palaces and peasant huts, chandeliers and hunger. While noble families dined beneath frescoed ceilings, millions of serfs, newly freed but still shackled by poverty, trudged through frozen fields. He ruled by divine right, but divine patience was running thin. In the cities, factories belched smoke into the sky, feeding an army of workers whose lives were measured in soot and blood. Newspapers whispered of democracy, revolution, and change, foreign words that carried the scent of danger. Still, Nicholas held to his father's old ways. Autocracy, he said, is not a choice. It is my birthright. But behind the firmness of those words lay fear. He loved his country, yet he did not understand it. He loved his people, yet he did not hear them. His salvation, or his undoing, came wrapped in silk and devotion. Alexandra Feodorovna, the German-born princess who became his empress, was his compass, his confidant, his only true world. "Nicky," she wrote to him, "we are one soul, one body, one heart." But the people did not love her. To them she was a foreigner, a whispering presence who brought strange ideas into the palace. And soon the whispers would become storms. The new century dawned not with celebration, but with fire. In 1905, the empire trembled. It began with hunger, and it always did. A procession of workers, led by a gentle priest named Father Gapon, marched through the streets of St. Petersburg toward the Winter Palace, carrying icons and petitions. They came unarmed, singing hymns, asking only for bread, justice, and mercy. But mercy did not come. As they approached the palace gates, soldiers raised their rifles. The shots cracked through the icy air, echoing across the Neva. Men, women, and children fell into the snow, their prayers drowned by the roar of gunfire. The day would be remembered as Bloody Sunday. When the news reached Nicholas, he was horrified, yet distant. "It pains me deeply," he wrote, "but the empire must be protected." In that single decision, that cold silence, the thread between Tsar and people began to unravel. Strikes spread through the cities. Peasants burned estates. Soldiers mutinied. And for the first time in 3 centuries, the Romanov throne trembled. Under pressure, Nicholas signed the October Manifesto, promising a Duma, a parliament, and civil rights. But even this concession was given grudgingly, reluctantly, like a man surrendering air one breath at a time. "They may talk," he said, "but I shall rule." The empire quieted, and for a moment. Yet beneath the surface, revolution grew like rot beneath gold leaf. In those years, the world changed faster than Nicholas could follow. Telegraphs hummed. Trains shrieked across the steppes. New ideas, socialism, equality, freedom, spread through Russia like sparks on dry hay. And yet, in the palaces of Tsarskoye Selo, time seemed frozen. Nicholas loved simple things: chopping wood, long walks, the laughter of his children. In the palace gardens, he would stroll hand in hand with his daughters, their white dresses brushing against the lilacs. "Papa," little Anastasia would say, "why does everyone bow?" He would smile softly, brushing her hair aside. "Because," he said, "they love us." But love was fading. The empire he cherished was dying, not from bullets or foreign armies, but from its own forgotten heart. The peasants prayed less for the Tsar and more for change. The workers no longer sang hymns to God, but to revolution. And somewhere deep within Nicholas, the realization began to take root that faith alone could not hold back the tide. In the winter of 1913, the Romanovs celebrated the 300th anniversary of their dynasty. Moscow glittered with banners and fireworks. Priests blessed the streets. Crowds cheered as Nicholas appeared on the Kremlin balcony, waving with that shy, hesitant smile that had once charmed his people. It was a vision of splendor and illusion. Behind the gold, the cracks were widening. The treasury was bleeding. The army was outdated. And beyond the borders, Europe was moving toward a storm called war. In the midst of the celebration, an aging general leaned toward a foreign diplomat and whispered, "The Romanov sun is setting." The diplomat smiled faintly. "Then God help Russia when it falls." That night, the fireworks burst over the Moscow sky, red, gold, and white. Nicholas watched them from the palace window, the reflection of each explosion flickering in his eyes. Alexandra stood beside him, her hand resting gently on his. "Do you see them, Nicky?" she said softly. "They love you still?" He nodded but said nothing. Outside, the last firework faded into smoke, and the darkness returned. The following summer, the guns of Europe roared to life. The Great War had begun. Nicholas, believing in honor and divine duty, led Russia into battle against Germany and Austria. Millions cheered as he promised victory. For God, for Tsar, for fatherland. But as the war dragged on, the cheers turned to silence. From the trenches came letters soaked in mud and despair. "We have no boot," wrote one soldier. "We have no bread." From the cities came riots, shortages, hunger. The once mighty Russian army was starving and dying for a war it could not win. In 1915, Nicholas made the fateful choice to take direct command of the army, leaving his throne and his fragile empire in the hands of Alexandra. That decision would break them both. For as the Tsar rode to the front, a shadow entered the palace, a man whose name would be whispered with both reverence and hate, Grigory Rasputin. And as snow fell once more over the frozen fields of Russia, the Tsar's train rumbled into the distance, its black smoke rising into a gray sky. In the flicker of the lanterns, Nicholas wrote in his diary, "I feel calm. Everything is in God's hands." But in Petrograd, revolution had already begun to breathe, and the last Tsar of Russia, gentle, faithful, doomed, was riding straight into the storm. The train rumbled across endless white fields, its wheels groaning like distant thunder. Inside the royal carriage, Nicholas sat by the window, his hand pressed against the frost-covered glass. Beyond the pale horizon, Russia stretched on forever, vast, beautiful, and broken. He watched peasants trudging through the snow, their figures bent like shadows. He wondered, do they still believe in me? At the front, soldiers huddled near the furnace, their breath fogging in the cold air. One of them, barely 18, whispered, "For the Tsar," before coughing blood into his glove. The words hung in the air like a prayer that had lost its meaning. Nicholas closed his eyes. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he saw his father's face, stern, commanding, and his own reflection, smaller, softer. "Afraid," he whispered. "I am trying, Papa." But there was no answer. Only the rhythm of steel on steel carrying him farther from his home and deeper into a war he could not win. At Tsarskoye Selo, Alexandra prayed. The palace was silent except for the faint ticking of a clock and the distant cry of the youngest child, Alexei. The boy's illness and the bleeding that would not stop when had returned again. His mother knelt beside his bed, clutching a silver cross, her whisper trembling. "God, not my son. Take everything but not him." And then came Rasputin. He entered the room like a shadow, tall, wild-eyed, his beard tangled, his boots muddy from the journey. The servants crossed themselves in fear. Alexandra, desperate and hollow, looked up at him as if he were both prophet and last hope. "Batushka," she said, using the word for little father. "Save him." Rasputin placed his rough hand on Alexei's head, murmuring a prayer that seemed half magic, half madness. Hours passed. The child slept. When he woke, the bleeding had stopped. To Alexandra, it was a miracle. To the Empire, it was blasphemy. She wrote to Nicholas at the front, "Our friend has saved the child again. You must trust him, Nicky, he is sent by God." But others saw only danger. Ministers, generals, even members of the royal family whispered that Rasputin's influence was poisoning the crown. In smoky rooms and candlelit salons, they spoke his name as if invoking a curse. He commands the empress. He appoints the ministers. He rules through her, and she through the Tsar. And as soldiers froze in the trenches, the capital burned with gossip. Nicholas returned from the front in 1916 to find his empire unrecognizable. Prices had doubled. Bread lines stretched for miles. The Duma had turned against him. And still, Alexandra defended Rasputin with unshaken faith. He confronted her one winter evening. The snow outside beat against the windows like small fists. "Alex," he said softly, "they despise him. They despise us because of him." Her eyes shone with anger and exhaustion. "They despise us because they do not understand," she whispered. "You must not abandon those whom God sends. God does not send men like Rasputin." Silence fell, heavy, cold, unbreakable. Between them, love still lived, but it was buried beneath years of fear, guilt, and faith. That night, Nicholas wrote in his diary, "All around me is treachery and deceit." And he was right. In December, Rasputin's prophecy came true. He had once told the empress, "If I die at the hands of the common people, you and your children will live. But if I am killed by nobles, your blood will not remain on the throne." He was murdered soon after, poisoned, shot, drowned, by men who claimed to be saving Russia. But they had only cut the final thread of destiny. When news of Rasputin's death reached Alexandra, she wept uncontrollably. "Now we are lost," she said, and perhaps they already were. The year turned, and with it the empire. By 1917, the war had drained Russia's soul. Soldiers deserted in droves. Petrograd erupted in chaos. Crowds filled the streets shouting, "Bread! Peace! Freedom!" Nicholas, isolated at the front, refused to believe it. "They exaggerate," he told his aides. But when his train finally tried to return to the capital, it was stopped by his own army. On March 2, 1917, in a small railway carriage in Pskov, the Tsar of all the Russias took up a pen. His hands shook as he wrote the words that ended 3 centuries of Romanov rule. "In the name of God, I will abdicate the throne for myself and my son." Outside, the snow fell silently on the tracks. He turned to his aide-de-camp and said quietly, "There is no more Tsar." For a long moment no one spoke. Then, almost tenderly, the aide replied, "There is no more Russia, sire." The train carried him back through a country he no longer ruled. Villagers watched as it passed, their faces blank, unreadable. Some crossed themselves. Others turned away. In Petrograd, the crowds rejoiced. The empire was gone. The Romanov sun had finally set, but in a small wooden church near Tobolsk, a priest lit a candle and whispered, "God bless the emperor." Far away, in the last quiet corner of his heart, Nicholas still believed, somehow, that this was not the end. He wrote to Alexandra, "The children are cheerful. I am calm. Perhaps this is God's will. All will be well." But history had no mercy left to give. The storm had broken, and it was coming for them all. The candlelight trembled against the walls of Tsarskoye Selo. Beyond the frost-laced windows, the Russian night pressed close. Vast, breathless, endless. Inside, Empress Alexandra Feodorovna knelt before a small altar, her hands clasped, her lips moving in whispered prayer. The shadows of the icons danced across her pale face, tracing sorrow and devotion in equal measure. She prayed not for herself, but for her son, Alexei Nikolaevich, heir to the Russian throne, the boy with the cursed blood, hemophilia. The word was never spoken aloud in the palace. It was too cruel, too dangerous. A single bruise could mean death. A stumble, a scrape, a cough, and the child would bleed within, unseen, unstoppable, and so the empress prayed. Her ladies-in-waiting often heard her voice through the heavy doors, trembling with desperation. "O Lord, spare him. Spare my child." The Tsar loved his family dearly, but at the front lines, duty consumed him. He saw his soldiers freezing, dying, losing faith. He could not see the slow collapse of the family he left behind, and into that emptiness and into that silent, echoing chamber of fear stepped Grigory Yefimovich Rasputin. He came from Siberia, a wandering monk with eyes that seemed to pierce through flesh into soul. His beard was wild, his hands rough, his scent heavy with sweat and incense. To the nobility he was filth. To Alexandra, he was salvation. Their first meeting was like a dream and a nightmare entwined. It was autumn of 1907 when the Empress received him in her private chambers. The boy had suffered another attack, days of bleeding, fever, delirium. Doctors had failed. Priests had failed. Alexandra was breaking. Rasputin entered quietly without bow or ceremony. "Do not cry," he said softly. "Your son will live." He knelt beside the bed and murmured words no one understood, a mixture of prayer and command. He touched the boy's forehead, then stepped back into the shadows. By morning, the bleeding had stopped. For Alexandra, it was not coincidence. It was divine. From that night forward, Rasputin was bound to her heart, her faith, her every decision. In the corridors of power, whispers multiplied like smoke. Ministers murmured that the empress was under a spell. Courtiers said the monk's presence defiled the palace. The Dowager Empress, Maria Feodorovna, wrote to her son, "That man is destroying the crown. You must send him away." But Nicholas, gentle and weary, could not deny the one who saved his son. "He brings her peace," he said quietly. And peace is rare. Rasputin used no titles when speaking to the royal couple. He called them Papa and Mama. To the Tsar's daughters, he was our friend. He blessed them, wrote to them, prayed with them. To the outside world it was scandal. Newspapers began to print caricatures of the mad monk, the peasant who controlled the Tsar through the empress's faith. They accused him of drunkenness, debauchery, corruption. Even his miracles were mocked, yet the empress clung tighter. "Let them hate," she told Nicholas. "God works through suffering." Her letters became her confessions, hundreds of them written in delicate script, full of trembling love and belief. "My beloved one, our friend tells me to be strong. He says all will be well. I believe him, trust him as I do." When the Tsar's advisors tried to intervene, Rasputin would send messages that struck fear into their hearts. "Do not oppose me. If you do, disaster will follow." And when they ignored him, disaster often came. A general dismissed for criticizing Rasputin was soon disgraced. A minister who called him devil died of sudden illness. Each event deepened the myth. Was it coincidence or curse? The empress never doubted. She saw only miracles. But faith is a fragile empire. In the salons of Petrograd, noble women whispered stories too sordid to print. They said Rasputin seduced the empress's ladies, that he boasted of touching the holy ones, that his prayers were mixed with sin. None dared speak these words to Alexandra's face. Her eyes could cut through any lie, her voice cold as crystal. Yet even she could not ignore the laughter behind her back. When her friend Anna Virabova tried to warn her, the empress replied simply, "You cannot understand faith if you have never needed a miracle." But miracles were running out. As the war dragged on, the palace became a fortress of isolation. The once bright rooms grew dim. Curtains stayed drawn. Alexandra moved through the halls like a ghost, her rosary always in hand. She wrote to Nicholas every day, pages upon pages of love, prophecy, and fear. "Our friend says the Lord will protect you. Trust in him, my angel. Russia cannot fall." But outside those walls, Russia was already falling. By 1916, famine spread like plague. Prices soared. Soldiers mutinied. The Duma begged the Tsar to return to Petrograd, to face reality. He would not. And in his absence, Rasputin and the empress ruled in his name. Ministers came and went like pawns on a board. 1 month, the interior minister was replaced. Next, the prime minister. Rasputin's whispers reached Nicholas's ears through Alexandra's letters. Soft, persuasive, fatal. It was said that Russia had ceased to be a monarchy and had become something else entirely, a theocracy of madness. In December 1916, as snow fell upon the frozen Neva, a group of noblemen gathered in secret. Among them was Prince Felix Yusupov, heir to one of Russia's oldest families, and Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, cousin to the Tsar himself. They believed they were saving the empire from destruction. "We must kill Rasputin," Yusupov said, "or he will kill Russia." That night they lured him to the Moika Palace under the pretense of a private visit. In the basement, candles flickered on whitewashed walls. The scent of wine and cyanide filled the air. Yusupov greeted him with false warmth. "You will have some Madeira, Father Grigori." Rasputin smiled, eyes gleaming. For the soul's warmth, he drank, he ate. He blessed them all. The poison should have killed him within minutes. It did not. Panic set in. Yusupov drew a revolver and fired. Rasputin fell, blood darkening the floor. They left him there, but when Yusupov returned minutes later, the body was gone. He found Rasputin crawling across the floor, eyes wild, mouth muttering prayers. Another shot, then another. They dragged him into the snow, bound him and threw him into the freezing river. When his body was found days later, his lungs were full of water. He had drowned, alive. When word reached Alexandra, she collapsed. "They have murdered a holy man," she whispered. "And now Russia will drown in blood." Her prophecy came true within months. The murder of Rasputin did not save the empire. It destroyed what little faith remained. Without him, the empress lost her anchor. Without her, the Tsar lost his crown. By the spring of 1917, the streets of Petrograd erupted in revolution. The palace gates fell. The Tsar was forced to abdicate, and in the small hours of a March morning, soldiers arrived at Tsarskoye Selo. They informed the Empress that she was now a prisoner of the provisional government. She did not weep. She merely crossed herself and said, "It is the will of God." That night she sat alone in the nursery. The toys of her children lay scattered across the floor. Tiny bears, wooden blocks, a porcelain doll with a cracked face. She picked it up and whispered, "We are all broken things." The candle flickered. Somewhere beyond the walls, a bell tolled. Slow, distant, final. And though the empire she had loved was gone, Alexandra believed one truth to her dying breath, that she had been faithful, that she had done God's will, even if it led her and all she loved into the darkness. The wind off the Baltic carried the smell of smoke. It wound through the empty streets of Petrograd, past shuttered bakeries and broken windows, curling upward into a sky the color of iron. The city was starving. Bread was gone, coal was gone, and patience, the last fragile thread binding the empire, was gone too. It was February 1917, and Russia had reached its breaking point. At dawn, women lined the streets outside bakeries, their shawls drawn tight against the cold. Their breath mingled with the mist, rising like ghosts. "Bread!" they shouted. "Give us bread!" Soldiers watched from corners, unsure whether to obey the Tsar or the people. When the bakery doors stayed closed, someone threw a brick, then another. The windows shattered. Within hours the city had erupted. What began as hunger became revolution. The cries of mothers turned into the roar of a nation. Far away at the front, Nicholas received a telegram. Situation in Petrograd grave. Order to restore order. He frowned, thinking it another riot, another spark to be stamped out. But this fire would not be contained. As he ordered troops to the capital, the soldiers refused to fire. Some threw down their rifles. Others joined the crowds. The empire's army, the pride of the Tsars, had turned against its own ruler. By the time Nicholas's train tried to return to the city, it was too late. The tracks were blocked by rebels. In the small town of Pskov, beneath the flickering lamps of his railway carriage, the Tsar signed the paper that ended 300 years of Romanov reign. "I hereby abdicate the throne for myself and for my son." He placed the pen down and stared at his trembling hand. No trumpet sounded, no bell tolled, no angel wept. Only the wind against the glass and a whisper saying, "It is finished." In Petrograd, the crowds filled the streets, shouting with joy and disbelief. The Romanov eagle had fallen. In its place rose banners of red and white, symbols of a future still unformed. But revolutions do not feed the hungry. The provisional government, hurriedly assembled in March 1917, promised freedom, democracy, and victory in the war. Yet even freedom can taste bitter on an empty stomach. Factories stopped. Trains halted. Fields lay barren. The soldiers, tired of dying for a crown that no longer existed, deserted by the tens of thousands. They walked home in ragged lines, rifles slung over shoulders, eyes hollow. Many brought their anger with them. And in the chaos, another power was rising, one that whispered of peace, bread, and land. Its name was the Soviets. In the smoky chambers of the Tauride Palace, two Russias stared each other down. The provisional government, fragile and uncertain, and the Petrograd Soviet, driven by the fire of revolution. Between them stood a question that would define the century. Who truly ruled the nation, the men of the Duma, or the will of the people? In that turmoil, one man's voice began to echo louder than all others. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. From exile in Switzerland, he returned like a specter from the past, his words sharp as glass. No support for the government of capitalists. All power to the Soviets. The crowds listened. The workers listened. Even the soldiers listened. The empire that had once feared silence now roared with slogans and songs. Red flags fluttered over factories, rail stations, and barracks. But with each day, hope began to mix with something darker, vengeance. In a small town on the Tobol River, Nicholas and his family arrived under guard. Tobolsk was remote, quiet, surrounded by forests. The locals watched as the imperial train pulled in, carrying not rulers but prisoners. The Tsar stepped onto the platform, hat in hand. "We are not afraid," he said to his captors. "We are Russians as you are." He tried to believe it. He chopped wood, walked the snowy garden paths, wrote in his diary. "The children are cheerful," he noted. "We play bezik in the evenings. Life is peaceful." But beyond Tobolsk, Russia was burning. Factories were seized. Officers were executed. Peasants divided estates. The red tide rose higher. When word reached the Romanovs that Lenin had taken Petrograd and the Bolsheviks now ruled in the name of the people, Nicholas read the news twice, slowly, as if disbelief could change the words. He set the paper down. "So it is done," he said. Alexandra looked up from her sewing, her face pale. And what will become of us? Nicholas turned to the window where snow drifted gently across the pane. God knows, he whispered. Only God. In the capital, the revolution devoured itself. The Bolsheviks, under Lenin's iron hand, declared the birth of a new world. A world without czars, without nobles, without masters. But new worlds are built from ruin. The streets filled with red banners and soldiers shouting peace, land, and bread. Yet the war dragged on. Germany advanced deep into Russian soil. Entire cities vanished under retreat and starvation. At Brest-Litovsk, the new Soviet government signed a peace that cost Russia nearly half its land. Poland, Finland, Ukraine, and more. The dream of empire was reduced to a shadow. And in that vacuum, civil war erupted. The Red Army fought the White, brother against brother, village against village. The land soaked in blood that no prayer could wash away. Back in Tobolsk, the Romanovs prayed for news. They received none. Their letters went unread, their petitions unanswered. Guards came and went, their eyes cold and distant. When spring came in 1918, the family was told they were being moved for their safety. The Tsar nodded, believing it a mercy. Alexandra packed icons, letters, and a small chest of keepsakes. The children helped, silent but obedient. As the train pulled away, they looked out at the endless birch forests, the same trees that had once lined their palace gardens, now ghostly witnesses to their fall. None of them knew it would be their last journey. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Lenin spoke to a crowd of workers. His voice carried over the roar of applause. We have destroyed the old world. The Tsarist order is dead. Russia belongs to her people. The words shook the air, but beneath the cheering there was unease. The old world had died, but the new one bled in its cradle. Cities lay in ruin. Famine stalked the countryside. Train stations became camps of the lost. And through it all, rumors spread. The Tsar still lives. The Whites will restore him. The Germans will save him. To the Bolsheviks, such rumors were poison. The Romanovs had to disappear, not as prisoners, but as ghosts erased from memory. In Yekaterinburg, the Ipatiev House awaited. Locals called it the House of Special Purpose. It stood on a quiet street, ordinary, forgettable. Inside, its rooms were cleared, its windows whitewashed, its doors reinforced. When the Romanovs arrived, they were met by a man named Yakov Yurovsky. His eyes were dark, unreadable. You will stay here temporarily, he told them. Nicholas smiled faintly. I understand. But Alexandra, sensing what her husband would not, shivered. She touched the small cross around her neck and whispered, God's will be done. Outside, Russia raged. The Whites advanced from the south, claiming they would free the Tsar. The Reds vowed to stop them at any cost. Within the walls of the Ipatiev House, time slowed. The family lived quietly, obediently. They read, prayed, took walks in the garden under guard. Nicholas wrote in his diary, weather warm, played dominoes. God have mercy on Russia. The Empress taught the girls embroidery. Alexei played with his spaniel Joy. They smiled, laughed even. But beneath it all was the knowing, the quiet, unbearable waiting. Each night, when the lights went out, they heard the boots of guards in the hallway, the clatter of rifles, the soft murmur of voices. The empire they once ruled had vanished. The new world outside no longer spoke their language, and in the silence between those walls, the fire of revolution burned ever closer. It was a gray spring morning when the train hissed to a halt in Yekaterinburg. Smoke drifted through the air, carrying the acrid scent of coal and rain. The once proud Romanovs, Tsar Nicholas II, Empress Alexandra, and their 5 children, stepped onto the platform surrounded by red guards. There were no cheers, no banners, no bowed heads. Only silence, broken by the distant tolling of a church bell that no longer rang for them. The journey from Tobolsk had been long and uneasy. Along the way, peasants gathered at the tracks to watch. Some crossed themselves, others spat. To them, the family in the train car were no longer rulers but relics, ghosts of a world already gone. Yurovsky, the man in charge of their custody, met them with a tight nod. You will stay in a safe house, he said, for your protection. He led them through narrow streets until they reached a 2-story house on the corner of Voznesensky Lane. Whitewashed walls, barred windows, a high wooden fence newly built around it. The locals whispered its name, Dom Osobogo Nazначenia, the House of Special Purpose. Nicholas looked up at it and said quietly, It seems comfortable enough. Alexandra said nothing. She only clutched her son's hand a little tighter. Inside, the rooms were bare. The family was given the upper floor. 2 bedrooms, a dining area, a sitting room. The guards occupied the rest. The walls were stripped of icons, the windows painted over. Even the garden outside, once full of lilacs, was now enclosed by planks that shut out the world. They were forbidden visitors, letters, or prayer gatherings. All clocks were removed. The Empress asked why. For your peace, Yurovsky replied. The days blurred together. The Tsar kept a small diary, his handwriting neat, steady. 7 May, weather clear. Walked in the garden with the girls. Olga unwell again. God grant patience. The Empress wrote letters she could never send. To her sister in Denmark. To the Dowager Empress in Crimea. To friends now scattered across Europe. She ended each one the same way. We are calm and in God's hands. Yet at night when the house fell still, the sound of boots in the corridor told another story. The guards changed frequently. Some were cruel, mocking. Others were quiet, almost ashamed. One, a young soldier named Mikhail, would later recall, they were like any family. The children laughed sometimes. The Tsar was polite. The Empress thanked us when we brought water, but there was a sadness, a kind I had never seen before. Even in captivity, the Romanovs held to their rituals. Every morning, Nicholas shaved and dressed in his uniform, faded now but still pressed. The family ate together, said their prayers and walked in the small fenced yard. The girls helped their mother sew. Sometimes they sang hymns under their breath, their voices barely audible beyond the painted windows. For a while, there was hope. Rumors drifted through the guards, that the Germans were coming, that the Whites were near, that they would soon be rescued. Papa, Maria asked one afternoon as they sat by the window, will we go home soon? Nicholas smiled softly. Yes, my dear. God will not forget us. But the silence outside said otherwise. By June, Yekaterinburg was a city divided. The Red soldiers who guarded the Romanovs feared the White Army's advance. Every day brought new orders from Moscow, new warnings from Lenin's council. If the Whites reach the city, one message read, the prisoners must not be allowed to fall into their hands. Inside the house, Alexandra's health deteriorated. Her legs swelled, her heart weakened, her spirit dimmed. Olga, the eldest daughter, wrote in her own journal, Mama prays often. Papa keeps strong for us all. We try to smile, though we feel the end is near. The guards began to drink heavily. Some nights their laughter echoed through the walls, followed by arguments, slamming doors, curses. Once Anastasia was caught peeking through a gap in the fence. A guard pushed her back roughly, shouting, No more looking out! She stared at him with the defiance of youth and whispered, You cannot stop us from seeing heaven. In late June, the Tsar's beloved dog, Joy, was taken away by the guards. Nicholas pleaded gently. But Yurovsky shook his head. Rules, he said. No animals in confinement. That night the Tsar wrote, They took Joy. Strange how one grows attached to small things. The girls cried. I consoled them as best I could. The next day he gave his gold watch to Alexei. When I am gone, he said, keep it safe. It has always kept the right time. Time. It was the one thing left to count, and it was running out. On July 13th, a priest was allowed into the house to hold service. The family stood together, singing softly. The guards watched from the doorway, their faces unreadable. When it ended, the Tsar turned to Yurovsky and said, Thank you for granting us this mercy. Yurovsky replied, It may be your last. The words hung in the air like smoke. That evening, Nicholas sat with his daughters, teaching them how to play bezique. Alexandra read aloud from the Gospel of John, Let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid. Outside, thunder rolled over the city. 2 days later, on July 15th, Yurovsky received a coded telegram. He read it twice, then folded it neatly and slipped it into his pocket. The message was simple, cold, and final. It has been decided. He spent the next 2 days preparing. Extra guards were called in. Rifles were checked. The basement was cleared. He ordered his men to gather sheets to muffle sound. To the family he said only, You must be ready to move soon. For your safety. Alexandra believed him. She told the children to pack. That night, Olga wrote one last entry in her notebook. Papa is calm. Mama prays. We will go somewhere new, they say. I wonder if we shall see the sea again. At dawn on July 17th, the family was awakened. Get dressed, said the guard at the door. You are being moved. The girls hurried into their dresses, fastening jewels into their bodices as they had been taught, the diamonds hidden beneath layers of cloth. Their last defense. Alexei, weak from illness, was carried in his father's arms. They descended the stairs slowly, their footsteps echoing through the narrow hall. The smell of damp and gun oil filled the air. The basement was small, whitewashed, lit by a single bulb that flickered above. A few chairs had been placed against the wall. Yurovsky entered, his expression unreadable. Nicholas turned to him. May we have chairs for the ladies? He asked quietly. Yes, Yurovsky said. Of course, the family sat. The guards filed in, 10 of them, rifles ready. Alexandra looked up, confused. Surely this is unnecessary, she said. We are ready to leave. Yurovsky cleared his throat and read from a paper. Nikolai Alexandrovich, your relatives have continued their attack on Soviet Russia. The Ural Executive Committee has decided to execute you. Nicholas blinked. What? He turned once toward his family. What? The rifles lifted. The light flickered once and went out. Outside, the city slept under a curtain of rain. Inside the house, the sound of gunfire shattered the silence of history. It lasted less than 20 minutes. When it was over, the men stood in the choking smoke, their faces pale. The walls were pocked with bullet holes. The air reeked of powder and blood. Yurovsky ordered it cleaned before dawn. The bodies were wrapped in sheets, carried to a waiting truck, and driven into the forest outside the city. There, in the early light of morning, they were buried in a shallow pit, covered with lime and earth, and so ended the house of special purpose, not as a home, but as a tomb. For decades the truth was buried with them. Officially the Romanovs had been moved. No names, no graves, no mourning, but silence has a way of echoing through time. Whispers spread. Travelers spoke of strange lights in the forest, of soldiers who could not sleep, of a dog seen wandering the fields, a small spaniel that would not leave the trees, and somewhere beneath the birch and pine, the empire that once spanned the world lay sleeping, waiting to be found again. It began with a whisper. A single command passed through dim corridors and locked rooms. The order came from Moscow, its language clinical, stripped of mercy. The question of the Romanovs must be resolved. Outside, the night of July 16, 1918, lay heavy over Yekaterinburg. The air was thick with rain and gun oil. The guards smoked in silence, their faces pale in the flickering lamplight. Inside the Ipatiev House, the family slept, or pretended to. The Empress had prayed longer than usual that evening, her voice barely audible. "Protect them, O Lord," she whispered. "Whatever comes, let it be quick." Nicholas sat by the window looking out at the pale sky. It was midsummer, and even near midnight the horizon glowed faintly, a ghost of daylight that refused to die. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small icon of the Savior, the paint worn smooth by years of touch. He kissed it once and placed it beside his bed. "I am not afraid," he said quietly. "We have lived in truth." Then, for the last time, he blew out the candle. Shortly after midnight, the door opened. Yurovsky entered, his boots wet from the rain. "Get dressed," he said. "You are being moved." Nicholas rose immediately. "Very well." The Empress crossed herself. The girls stirred, blinking sleep from their eyes. Alexei groaned, too weak to stand, so his father lifted him gently into his arms. Down the narrow staircase they went, the floorboards creaking beneath their steps. The house was silent except for the soft shuffle of feet, the rustle of skirts. They entered the small basement room. Low ceiling, whitewashed walls, a single bulb burning overhead. Nicholas turned to Yurovsky. "May we have chairs for the ladies?" he asked, as he had 2 nights before. Yurovsky nodded. "Yes, of course." The guards brought in a few wooden chairs. The family sat. Anastasia yawned softly. Maria held Alexei's hand. Alexandra looked up, her face pale but serene. "How long will this take?" she asked. "Not long," Yurovsky said. He pulled a folded paper from his pocket, his voice trembling slightly as he read. "Nikolai Alexandrovich, your relatives have continued their assault on Soviet Russia. Therefore, the Ural Executive Committee has decided to execute you." Nicholas blinked, confused. "What?" He turned toward his family. "What?" But the words were lost beneath the thunder of rifles. The sound filled the room, sharp, deafening, final. Muzzle flashes lit the walls, echoing like a storm trapped underground. The air grew thick with smoke and screams. For a moment, the world was only chaos. Bullets ricocheting, glass shattering, the smell of blood and cordite mingling in the heat. When it was over, silence fell. Then a cough, a cry. Someone still lived. The guards fired again. Anastasia's voice. "Mama!" Then nothing. It took 20 minutes before the room went still. 20 minutes to end a dynasty that had ruled for 3 centuries. Yurovsky stood among his men, his face ashen. "Check them," he said. "Quickly!" The bodies lay crumpled, their faces unrecognizable, their jewels glinting beneath torn fabric. Diamonds sewn into corsets and hems, meant for ransom that would never come. He ordered the corpses loaded onto a truck, covered with tarpaulins. The engine roared to life, and the house of special purpose fell quiet once more. They drove into the forest, following a narrow road through the mist. The headlights carved tunnels through the trees. Rain fell harder now, soaking the earth. Yurovsky sat beside the driver, silent, his hands clenched. Behind them, the bodies swayed with every turn. When they reached the clearing near Koptyaki, they stopped. The men unloaded their burden beside an abandoned mine shaft. They stripped the corpses, poured sulfuric acid to erase the faces, burned what they could, and buried the rest in haste. The night swallowed their work. By dawn, only the wind remained, whispering through birch leaves, carrying the faint scent of smoke and iron, and the empire of the Romanovs was gone. For years afterward, their fate was a rumor. The new Soviet government denied the killings, then obscured them with half-truths. "The Tsar," they said, "has been executed. His family was moved to safety, but in taverns, whispers spread. Peasants swore they had seen the Empress alive in Siberia. Soldiers claimed Anastasia escaped. Legends bloomed in the cracks where history hid its guilt. One tale told of a young woman found half drowned in a German canal, her memory lost, her eyes hauntingly familiar. She called herself Anna Anderson, and for decades the world argued whether she was the last Romanov. Scientists, nobles, and survivors all came to see her. Some swore she was Anastasia. Others called her a fraud. Yet even as she aged, her face carried something the world could not dismiss: the ghost of a princess who refused to die. Meanwhile, the Ipatiev House became a wound upon Yekaterinburg's conscience. The Soviets walled it off, forbidding visitors. Its white walls turned gray with years, its windows boarded, its rooms emptied of sound. Locals crossed themselves when passing by. They called it Domus Procleatium, the cursed house, and though no one dared speak of what had happened there, the earth beneath it remembered. In 1977, under orders from Moscow, the house was demolished, its bricks scattered, its foundation buried, officially to remove a symbol of reaction, unofficially to silence the ghosts. But the silence did not hold. In 1991, as the Soviet Union crumbled, two men digging near Koptyaki uncovered something in the dirt: fragments of bone, charred cloth, a jeweled cross. Forensic teams descended on the site. The world watched as science began to do what history had refused: tell the truth. Through DNA testing, 9 skeletons were identified. Among them, Nicholas, Alexandra, and 3 of their daughters. 2 bodies were missing, Alexei and 1 sister, believed to be Maria or Anastasia. For years, mystery persisted. Then in 2007, another grave was found nearby, 2 smaller skeletons buried apart as if hidden by guilt. Tests confirmed what the earth already knew: the family had been reunited. In 1998, under a gray Russian sky, the Romanovs were finally laid to rest in the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg, the resting place of czars. Bells tolled across the city as their coffins were lowered into the vault. Nicholas, Alexandra, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, Alexei, names that had once ruled an empire, now spoken in prayer. Inside the cathedral, an old priest whispered as the incense rose, "O Lord, give rest to the souls of thy servants who bore the crown of suffering." Among the mourners were descendants of those who had once betrayed the family, and grandchildren of those who had died defending them. The sins of fathers and the tears of children mingled in that sacred silence. When the final hymn ended, the bells rang once more, slow, solemn, and clear. The echoes rolled over the Neva, past the gilded domes, past the winter palace where it had all begun. And in that moment, it seemed that history itself bowed its head. Yet even now, the ghosts of the Romanovs walk quietly through Russia's memory. Their portraits hang once more in churches. Their names are spoken not as rulers but as martyrs. In 2000, the Russian Orthodox Church canonized them as passion bearers, those who met death with grace, without vengeance. In the small hours of July 17th each year, pilgrims gather at the site of the Ipatiev House, now marked by a church. Candles flicker in the dark, their flames trembling like whispers of the past. The faithful walk into the forest, singing hymns through the dawn, following the same path the truck once took into the trees. The rain still falls there, soft and endless. The birches still sway, and if one listens closely in the hush between wind and prayer, one might hear a child's laughter, faint, far away, echoing through the leaves. The dynasty that ruled 1/6 of the world ended not with a crown, but with a whisper of bullets, of rain, of a family praying in the dark. History buried them in silence, but silence cannot hold forever, because somewhere in the Russian night, the past still breathes, quietly, endlessly, beneath the snow.